All right, welcome back. So, the patriarchs. First things first. Were these real people? Which is to say, in other words, are the biblical stories true? According to standard biblical chronology, the patriarchs lived in the late 3rd to early 2nd millennium BCE. So that's where we ought to be looking for historicity, if that's what we're after. And so we run into some problems. First problem, Abraham is said to live in the city of Beersheba. But archaeology tells us that Beersheba wasn't inhabited until around 1200 BC. So that's not so good. Similarly, Abraham is said to live among the Philistines. The Philistines for sure did not arrive until the 12th century BCE. Okay, so there's one kind of problem. What are some possible solutions? Well, I mean, maybe we shouldn't be going by what we call like biblical chronology. After all, that takes into account humans with unnaturally long lifespans, right? And that's maybe not a great basis for dating. But to say this verse is the true thing and that verse with the lifespans is not true is what we call cherry picking. Right? That's not a great way to make a case for historicity of the Bible, is to be like, it's historically accurate as long as I change some stuff, right? That doesn't work so well. Okay, so that's one problem and a solution that didn't work. Here's another problem. There are no extra biblical sources that mention the patriarchs. Right? We don't have any reference to any of them anywhere outside of the Bible. And so a possible response to that might be, so why would we expect there to be any, right? Like, these are just like, it's like a small family wandering around in Canaan for 3 generations. Why should anybody mention these people? Why would we even expect it? Fair enough. But according to the Bible, Abraham visited Pharaoh and defeated an army of 5 kings in battle and made a pact with another king and entered into a contract with some Hittites, and Isaac then made a pact with the king, and Jacob's sons destroyed an entire city. And, there's no record of any of this from any of these purported monarchs, cities, peoples, etc. In fact, of course, there's no record of any of these other characters in the Bible, the non-Israelites, existing either. Right? It's not like we have the court records of Abimelech, king of the Philistines, and he just happens not to mention Abraham, right? Like, that's not a person either, as far as we know. Okay, third problem. Perhaps to my mind the most significant, or the one that ought to give us a substantial pause. The others should too. When we ask about the truth of the biblical account, which version of the patriarchal story are we asking to be true? Right? Are we asking the one where Isaac lives in Beersheba, or the one where he lives in Hebron? Are we asking about the one in which Jacob goes to a place called Haran to find a wife and ends up with 4 and 12 kids, or the one where he goes to a place called Padan Aram? Right? When there are different stories, even within the Bible itself, how can we even ask whether the Bible is true in that sort of historical sense? And how would we choose which of the stories it is we're asking to be true? Does this mean that the patriarchs didn't exist at all? Not necessarily. There may well have been human beings named Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These are, after all, perfectly good 2nd millennium names. They are also, however, perfectly good 1st millennium names. Hell, they're perfectly good yesterday names. Right? Like, we just, as it turns out, don't have access to any verifiable facts about such people if they existed. And as such, we have to treat the biblical stories as stories, right? Not as historical reports. What kind of stories are we talking about then? Many episodes in the patriarchal accounts are an explanation for something, right? And the fancy word we use for this is etiologies, right? A story that explains where something comes from. And there are lots of etiologies in Genesis, and especially in the patriarchal stories. There are etiologies of places. Why is it that the area around the Dead Sea is entirely uninhabitable and salty? Oh, well, we have a story to explain that. Why is Beersheba called Beersheba? Well, we have a story to explain that. You have to understand from this that Beer means well, and Sheva means oath. So we have the oath well there. Why is there a sanctuary at the site of Bethel? Well, I know why, because I have a story telling me how and why, when Jacob erected the site there. Why is the city of Machanaim called Machanaim? Because Jacob said, this is God's camp, Machaneh. So we called it Machanaim. Why is Peniel called Peniel? Because Jacob called it that when he said, I've seen a divine being face to face, Pnei el Pnei. Why is the city of Sukkot called Sukkot? Because Jacob journeyed and he built their stalls, Sukkot, for his cattle, so it's called Sukkot. Right? Etiologies of places all over. There are etiologies of customs. Right? Why do the Israelites circumcise their sons? I have a story to explain why. Why do Israelites not eat the thigh muscle on the socket of the hip? I'll tell you why they don't eat the thigh muscle on the socket of the hip, because a divine being touched a dude there once. Right? There are etiologies of international relations. Right? Why is it that Ammon and Moab are located just on the other side of the Jordan from the Dead Sea? Right? And why are their languages so very much like Hebrew, but they're not Israelites? Well, they're related, right? They're our ancestors, nephews, incest kids. That's the story. I didn't make it up. Why do the Ishmaelites live in the wilderness? And why is their language pretty close to Hebrew? But they're not Israelites either, right? I know, because Ishmael was Abraham's kid. Why is Edom so close to Israel, right there? And they're usually friendly, but sometimes not so friendly. And their language is really close to Hebrew, but they're not Israelites. No, they're related to us, right? That's Esau, right? That's Jacob's brother. What is the origin of this on-again, off-again, friendly, fighting relationship with Aram to the north? Well, I've got a whole story about that too, about Jacob and Laban and, treacherous dealings and treaties made. So these stories are, as so much of literature is, a society's way of understanding itself. And the value isn't necessarily in the history that they purport to tell, but rather in what they reveal about how the authors thought about themselves and their world. In these etiologies, we're dealing with Israel as a nation, right? Individuals stand for something bigger, right? Esau is Edom, right? And Laban is the Arameans, and Jacob is Israel, right? So they're standing in for the larger people groups, but that's clearly not the case for all of the patriarchal tales, of course. When we read the stories themselves, we can know, okay, so maybe you're telling me something bigger about, the history of Israel's relationship with its neighbors, but you're telling me a story about a family, right? Israel, as a nation, doesn't exist until very late in the text that you read for today, right? And even then, it refers only to Jacob, right? Israel's not like the people Israel really until the book of Exodus. These are stories about a single family across 4 generations. And the driving issues in these stories are family issues. Right? There's stories about marriage, right? All the trio of what we call the wife-sister tales. There's got to be a better name for. The other name we use, by the way, is in scholarship is the ancestress in danger stories, which is worse. But you know the ones I mean. We've got marriage there, right? The search for Rebekah in Genesis 24. Jacob's serving, 7 years for Leah and Rachel. We have the story of Dinah and Shechem in Genesis 34. So marriage is a big part of these stories, routinely. Lots of stories about parenthood, right? The desperation of Abraham for a son that will continue his line. The near sacrifice of Isaac, right? The barrenness of the matriarchs. the affection of Isaac for Esau and of Rebekah for Jacob, right? The competition between Rachel and Leah over children, Jacob's disappointments with his kids, Simeon and Levi and Reuben. Right? There's lots of stuff that it talks about parenthood. And of course, there's plenty of sibling stuff in there too. Jacob versus Ishmael, Rachel and Leah, Jacob and Esau. Some of these family stories do have like broader national interests at stake, but the force of them for the reader, I think, is, as has been clearly shown over the last couple of thousand years, the force of the stories lies in their remarkable insight into family life. Right? They ring true, right? They resonate, they're recognizable as people. Okay, so how is it that we're suddenly reading a family saga? Right? We just finished, after all, the primeval history, which was about all of humanity. Right? And suddenly we're like narrowed down to one person and his descendants. So the obvious answer is we're doing that because God, in Genesis 12, chose Abraham to be the recipient of blessing. But why? Why Abraham? Honestly, why anyone in particular at all? Right? What does God want that he chooses Abraham? And I would say more than wants. What is it that God needs? And that's something that's occasionally hard to wrap our head around, in part because we today don't think of God as having needs particularly. But, as is so often the case, that's maybe our problem and not the Bible's. What God wants and needs, it seems, is devoted worship and obedience. And God was not getting that from humanity as a whole. And that's what the primeval history is basically about. From Adam and Eve and Cain and Lamech and the generation of the flood, right? Disobedient humans, and especially true of the generation of the Tower of Babel. Right? The builders of the Tower of Babel didn't rely on God. Right? They wanted to make a name for themselves. Right? They were going to take it on themselves. And so, because they didn't rely on God, God spreads them across the entire earth. It's harder to deal with the people when they're everywhere. Right? It was easier when all of humanity was moving in a block, and there was only a few of them. It turned out that all of humanity just wasn't doing it for God, as it were. So he, having spread them out and dispersed them, he can't deal with humanity as a whole anymore, and starts over. Just as in the flood story, God recognizes humanity's essential wickedness, so at this point it seems he recognizes that humanity as a whole can't provide him with what he needs, which is, consistent obedience. So what God does is chooses one family that he can treat on an individual basis. And he recognizes that humans won't obey just for the sake of obeying. Right? They need to be given a reason. Right? They need a carrot. So what's the reason God gives? What's the carrot? God will make Abraham into a great nation. Now, you'll recall, right, just a couple of chapters earlier, we had what's called the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. We had the list of all the nations of the world and where they came from. And God is saying to this one family, I'm going to make you into something new. Not one of those existing nations. I'm going to make you into a new nation. And God will make Abraham's name great. In other words, precisely the thing that the builders of the Tower of Babel tried to do for themselves, but couldn't. Right? Precisely because they tried to do it for themselves. God says, I can do this for you. This is my role. And God will bless those who bless Abraham and curse those who curse him. And we have a reasonable sense of what divine curses look like from previous stories. It's not so nice. And the last little clause here, all the families of the earth will bless themselves by Abraham. Now, depending on which Bible you read, you may hear that or see that in a slightly different form. It may come into your head or come to you in your text as the family of the earth will be blessed in you, something like that. And I want to point out here that there is a reasonably stark divergence here between Christian and Jewish interpretations, and hence translations, just like Genesis 1:1, of this promise, of this blessing. For Christianity, the nations of the earth will be blessed in you has to do with, essentially like the spread of Christianity. Right, like this is you guys know better than I do how this works. But it has to do with, right, something inherent in Abraham, right, and like the descendants in Israel becoming, expanding and spreading. But I don't think that's what it meant here originally. Not to say that the Christian interpretation is wrong, just to know that it's an interpretation. The Jewish interpretation of this clause is as it reads here: the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. What does that mean? That means that when one non-Israelite wants to bless another non-Israelite, they'll say something like, "May you be as blessed as Abraham." In other words, what God is saying is you're going to be a model. Right? You're going to be a model for other people to follow. Right? God hopes that in this way, the rest of humanity will sort of come around to obedience on their own, right? They're going to see how blessed Abraham is and the kinds of blessings that obedience brings. And so, right, God, rather than saying, I'm going to force everybody to obey, knowing that that hasn't worked in the past, God says, I'm going to make one family really blessed and they're going to be super obedient to me, and hopefully everyone will see like the cause and effect, right? This will be apparent and people will decide to change their ways. Now, the promises that we read here in Genesis 12, a great nation, blessing, great name, blessings, they're pretty general. Those are some pretty general statements. And it's really only after, remember that God says this to Abraham before he's left his homeland, only after Abraham has actually gone to the land does God give him the specifics of the blessing. And so what does it mean to have God's blessing? What does it mean to be the recipient of this divine promise? Two things: land and progeny. Land and progeny. This is what it means to be a great nation. You can't be a great nation without a homeland, without a place, at least not in the biblical conception. And you can't be a great nation without enough peoples to be a great nation. Right? So you can't have one of these and not the other. Right? You have this. It's one promise to be a great nation in two connected parts: land and progeny. Okay, so what's strange as you read the text, you may have realized upon reading it, I'm assuming that you read it. What's strange is that after promising Abraham these things, land and progeny, God promises them again. Here we have progeny and then land. A couple of chapters later, here they are again. And then a couple of chapters later, here they are again. I'll make you fertile or fruitful, and I'll assign the land to you. And each time God gives the promise, it's the same thing, land and progeny, but said in a different way, in a different place, at a different time. So, you'll be shocked to hear, each of our Pentateuchal sources has this promise in it, right? The patriarchal promise of land and progeny, and we will talk more about that next class. I want now to just point out that there are, though it's the same basic promise, land and progeny, there are differences among them, certainly in the way that they are expressed. Right? The J source, which you will soon become accustomed to being blue, the J source really loves to talk about blessing. That's Genesis 12, 1 through 3. I will bless you, you'll be a blessing, right? I'll bless those who bless you, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see a few of those here. Right? blessings and altar buildings. There are in, I put this slide up prematurely. In any case, there's some J stuff for you. Let's go back. I thought I had a slide for blessing. I don't. J is all about blessing. It comes up again and again when you read the promises. E has fewer examples of the promise, but is regularly referring to Egypt, right? So in Genesis 15, God says, I'm going to give you all this stuff, but your descendants are going to go down and live be strangers in a strange land, right? That famous stuff. E likes to say things like, insert name of patriarch here, do not fear, right? That's like a very E kind of way of expressing things. P talks about kings emerging from your loins, and talks about giving the land as like an everlasting holding, right? That's P concepts and language. So they talk about things slightly differently with different thematic accents. They do have some things in common aside from the basic structure, which is the promise is passed on from father to son. Only one son in every generation can get a promise, and each patriarch only receives the promise once. Right? Is in each of the sources, no patriarch gets the promise multiple times in any given source. Right? So when you see the promise happening again and again to Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, you're looking at multiple sources telling that promise. Okay, so land and progeny are the two main issues here. How did these two aspects play out over the course of the patriarchal stories? Well, possession of land doesn't happen, right? Because, of course, Israel doesn't actually come to fully possess the land until after the entire Pentateuch. Right? Like, that doesn't happen in the first 5 books, somewhat remarkably. But there are some initial claims to the land. Now you're going to get those slides I just had up. They're going to make a lot more sense now. Initial claims to the land. In J, Abraham builds altars, right? In Bethel and Hebron, and Jacob builds a house for himself and his cattle in Sukkot. Right? These are initial claims to land. This is the putting down of some roots. In E, Jacob buys land and builds an altar in Shechem and in Bethel. And in the most extensive and boring version, we have a whole entire chapter in P of Genesis 23 of Abraham purchasing a gravesite in Hebron. Right? These are all altar building and town building and houses and grave sites. These are all ways of laying claim to the land as part of the family heritage. Right? That's what they're doing here. So that's the land part. Of course, it's piecemeal, right? Because they're not going to fully possess it for a few generations yet. Offspring is where Genesis really is focused. Right? The fulfillment of the offspring half of the promise is really the central story of Genesis. And it is in no way a straightforward fulfillment, of course. There are challenges at almost every step. In J, right off the bat, Abraham and Sarah, because of famine, are sent, go down to Egypt, and Pharaoh takes Sarah into his harem, to put it plainly. That's a problem for their potential offspring. Sarah, more to the point, is barren. Rebecca is barren. Isaac and Rebecca then go down to Egypt and go through the whole same thing where, she almost gets taken up into a foreign court. Esau tries to kill Jacob. That's probably not going to, before he's got kids. Rachel is barren. Right, there's a lot of problems to overcome when it comes to offspring. That's all in J. In E, Abraham has no offspring. That's the beginning of Genesis 15. He's like, who's going to inherit from me? I have no kids. In E, Abraham and Sarah also go down to Egypt and run into trouble there. The main one from E you may be most familiar with is the sacrifice of Isaac. Right? That one would put a real crimp in the plans. In P, there are no challenges to the potential of offspring, which is a nice way of remembering, at least in this initial stage, that the sources of the Pentateuch may have the same overarching story, but don't tell them in the same way, right? For us, we look at Genesis and we're like, it's all about, how are they going to have offspring? There's so many challenges, and when you look at P on its own, it's not even an issue. Right? No one's worried about it. It's fine. Some of these challenges are presented like just by life, right? Infertility is not something imposed by the deity. It's just like it's a thing that happens to happen, and then God helps the family overcome them. And some of the challenges are imposed by God directly, like, hey, kill that one kid of yours, right? But by the end of the story, right, by the end of Genesis, Jacob has 12 sons, right, and they are the progeny promised who will become the nation that will be the great nation. So the progeny part is well on its way. The patriarchal stories, these family stories, are so beloved. I would guess that they are among the stories most familiar to all of you and most folks that you know in most of the Hebrew Bible. They speak to us as readers, right? We relate not only because of the situations, many of which we might relate to directly, but also just because of the essential humanity of these characters. Right? They feel like real people with real problems in a way that is not always true in the Bible, right? It's kind of hard to relate to Moses. No one's like, man, I really know how Moses felt. Like, nope, you don't. Maybe the BTFO coordinators, I don't know. Right, but the patriarchs seem very real. They seem very real. And this is because, in part, they're not morally perfect, except, again, in the priestly source where they are morally perfect. Even in P, there's no, Ishmael and Isaac are totally cool, and Jacob and Esau are totally cool. They get along fine. They're all good kids. P doesn't have a lot of conflict. But in J especially, the patriarchs make questionable decisions. Right? The whole wife-sister thing, right? Abraham and Sarah in Egypt. Abraham's treatment of Hagar and Ishmael, and actually Sarah's treatment of Hagar and Ishmael. Abraham is like, I'm going to argue with God for a bit right here. Right? That's pretty ballsy. Right? How dare you? If Abraham's right, does that make God wrong? Right? That's maybe questionable. Jacob, buying Esau's birthright with some soup. That's rude. Isaac and Rebekah have a thing in Egypt with the wife-sister thing. That's no good. Jacob stealing Esau's blessing, decidedly uncool. Jacob playing when he's with Lavan up in Aram, right, playing tricks with the flocks and essentially stealing all of Lavan's wealth. Right? All right, it was payback, but still. A small one that you might have missed, when Jacob is returning with his family and Esau's coming to meet him and he's afraid that Esau might attack. And so he puts Leah and her kids in front of Rachel and her kids, just in case. Right? Also uncool. Simeon and Levi just go off and slaughter Hamor and Shechem and the town. Reuben sleeps with his father's concubine. Anyway, I could probably go on. I don't know. That felt like a lot. There's a lot of questionable decisions out there. Right? The biblical authors don't present the patriarchs as exemplars. Right? They present them as human, which may give us, a moment to pause and think about, what did they think they were writing? It's regularly good to keep in mind, I think, that the authors didn't sit down and be like, I'm going to write the Bible now. Right? They weren't writing the Bible. They were writing the thing that they were writing, and it became the Bible, right? But we shouldn't impose, right, our understanding of what the Bible ought to be. It ought to be a moral code and a moral, right? That's us. We did that to the Bible, right? The biblical authors were writing stories about their ancestors, right? Traditional, long passed down, et cetera, which we'll talk about next time. Right? We can read these stories as morally and ethically informative, which is to say we can learn a lot from them, but we shouldn't take the patriarchs as models to be followed, right? And that would be true, I think, whether they really existed or not. Okay, I'm going to talk more about the patriarchs next time. I recognize that it has been some time since I had allowed time for folks to ask questions, and we've done a lot of stuff, especially like all the stuff with the sources, et cetera. So I would like to take, I've left a pretty significant chunk of time right here. I'd like to take this opportunity to hear from you and be able to answer questions and talk about anything up to this point in the class that I could address that might be fun or interesting to talk about. Tommy.
Yes, you said that the patriarchy is morally imperfect, except in Leviticus.
Except in the priestly source, right, in Genesis, right? Again, right, not the same stories, not told the same way. So we should, and we shouldn't expect them. I'll talk about this more over the course of this semester. We shouldn't expect them to be told the same way, right? And the same way that if we were telling sort of traditional stories about, I may use this example in a future lecture, I don't know, but the example I use all the time is like, two people can tell the same story and tell it from very different perspectives and very different angles, and even when there's like facts beneath it, which is not the case here, right? Like we're not talking about facts, we're talking about stories which can be manipulated and changed and over time and place and all these things. But even when we're talking about stories that have like definitive, like there was a thing that happened, if I ask somebody from Connecticut to tell me the history and story and moral of the Civil War, and I ask someone from Alabama to do the same thing, I'm not getting the same story. Right? But like there's like things that actually happened that everyone like can't be denied, and well, probably they could today. Anyway, the point is, right, we shouldn't expect stories to be told the same way. And yes, the priestly story, the priestly account, and we will see this as we move through, is not particularly interested in, conflict and tension, and it sort of more presents things like this is what happened, and this is what happened, and it was all planned out. And this is remember that P is the one who gave us Genesis 1 with a perfectly logical, systematic 7-day creation story, and it's basically like that all the way through. Whereas J is the one who gives us a creation story that within like the first chapter of it, God's like, man, I created a dude who's like all lonely. I should change a thing, right? Like it's constantly developing and adjusting and reacting, and that's true of God and people. Okay, what else can I? Yes, please.
Okay, on Friday you talked about how you can't split up the stories just based on
Style. Yeah.
How are they splitting up the stories if some of the stories are missing things completely? Like how did they figure out that source is missing something completely? How does that get attributed to that source?
Sure. Let me see if I can tell me if I'm responding to your question as I understand it. So one of the things that I pointed out was that, and I just did it again just now, right? Like the stories, the sources tell the stories differently with different claims about, and I talked about at the beginning of this class, even things like where people are living, right? And when they are, where they are. So if we come across a story that exists, that happens only once, like for example, I may talk about this next time, but the sacrifice of Isaac, right, which for us is like such an important story, right? Like only one of the Pentateuchal sources knows that story and tells that story. And frankly, no one else in the Bible ever cares about it again, right? We're the ones who are obsessed with it, not them. But that only occurs in one source. How do I know which source that's in when it only happens once? And the answer is not through discontinuity with things, but through continuity. Where are they coming from? Right? So they leave Beersheba. Okay, so according to which story were they living in Beersheba? God, speaks to Abraham in a particular way, right? Like makes reference to particular previous conversations. Abraham returns to a certain place, right? It's about connecting the threads again of plot. We can also see stylistic features. That connect it. It's an E, by the way. The sacrifice of Isaac is an E story. But there are many of those, right? There's lots of stories that only occur in one of the sources. And they're identifiable precisely because they belong to the plot and chronology and geography of one of the sources and not the others. It is essentially almost never the case that we're reading and go, man, this could really be anywhere. This could be in any of the sources, right? Because when you tell a story, right, you naturally keep people in the same place and with the same relationships and in the same chronologies. So it's just a question of sort of matching those up as we go through. Yeah, please.
Just to piggyback off of that, when you mentioned continuity and coherency and completeness as in your book, I'm wondering, because I haven't gotten there yet, what sorts of things the supplementary theorist or hypothesis has to say about that claim there, right? That coherency, completeness, continuity, those things, that's a major explanation for the documentary
Yeah.
hypothesis. So how would a supplementary hypothesis respond?
Did everyone hear the question? Should I repeat it? Okay. No. That's on the masks and the room. The question was, okay. So I keep going on about completeness and coherence and continuity and all this stuff as markers of sources, and the question was, okay, but for people who don't believe in sources, people who are referred to in my book at the very least, if not in this classroom, because I don't want to, it's like a Candyman. What do they? How do they respond? What do they say to? How do they deal with the issues that I talk about as completeness and continuity? So I'm going to really super briefly, for those of you who haven't gotten there, but will haven't gotten there in the reading. The major alternative theory to the one that I am giving you. I'm giving you a documentary hypothesis, and I think trying to explain why it works and how it works and why it's useful. The other major theory is that no, we don't have previously independent sources that were interwoven. What we have instead is essentially an original, maybe some original small units, like a Jacob story and an Abraham story that were sort of united, and then those were overlaid, and then that was overlaid, and so it's what's called supplementary, right? It becomes like layers rather than sources. That's the two basic sides. With the understanding that I also think that there are layers within sources and layers after sources, and they also understand that there are things that are united this way. It's not perfectly clean and easy, but that's the basic division. I think sources like this, and they think layers like this. And so where I see continuity among stories, I say, oh, this connects with this. I see in the story of Jacob seeing the ladder or the staircase, whatever, in Genesis 28, I look at that and I say, look, it says, Jacob is on a journey, and it says he's fleeing from his brother, and that connects it to the story where his brother's trying to kill him and he has to run away, and that connects to the story of him stealing Esau's, blessing, etc. Right? That all becomes a continuous one source, right? Because that's one plot altogether. And they look at it and say, no, it was originally a story about Jacob and Esau, and there's a different story about Jacob at Bethel. With the ladder and things, and there's a different story about Jacob going to get married. Those were all originally independent, and what connects them is somebody edited them all together and inserted all of this material that now connects them. And in brief, my response is, okay, so the way that you figured out that these were originally independent stories is you took out all the stuff that connected them, and then you said, these are independent, and I can tell you how they were connected too. And you put it all right back in. And that to me is a little like all of biblical studies is circular. We can admit this. But some circles are uglier than others, right? And that's, you'll get there in the book, and I think that's, I address it pretty well there. But yeah, for me, if it looks like it's continuous and picking up on claims made elsewhere, probably it was. Right, again, I'm thinking about what has the most explanatory power, and for me this does. Yeah?
And a multi-part question. So as someone who's new to the four sources and finding it really cool, is there somewhere we can read kind of linearly for each source independently? And then a sort of secondary question is that
Good. Terrific. I'll do the second one first. So from the beginnings, or like the real like crystallization of the four sources in the late 19th century until me standing in front of you today, I would say 85 to 90% has been agreed on the whole time. And we're mostly playing around the margins. And that is largely because the D source is super identifiable because it's all in basically within Deuteronomy. And the priestly source is super identifiable because it's like, there's all of Leviticus. There's like half of Numbers, there's half of Exodus, there's, and it's, it's got it's very strongly identifiable on plot and style and all those things. And most of the arguments among those who do documentary hypothesis stuff is about J and E and what's what, and those have always been harder to do. But again, 85 to 90% I think we've been pretty good on for the entire time. Those of us working on it today still occasionally like move things from one column to another. That's in part because scholars are by nature so dependent on what we learned and what came before us, and to change a thing is actually like requires, it's like a significant hill to climb. And so, as a brief example, just a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, I made the case for changing like 9 verses or something scattered throughout from what had always been E. I was like, I think they're J. And like, why did I? And it was the kind of thing I looked at. I was like, why did I ever think it was E before? Because everybody before me did, right? So I just never questioned it. I was like, yeah, okay, like they had their arguments, but like there's a lot of text here to work through. So arguments have to be made like bit by bit, and so little things change here and there. As a result, where people do publish full like versions of the sources, they're always going to be a tiny bit idiosyncratic, if not more than a tiny bit, depending on who's doing it. And this is the main reason I've never done it, right? My book doesn't have a full breakdown. My book is about how to break it down, not what the breakdown should be. Because if I had put in print what my breakdown was then, right now I'd be sitting here furious at myself for getting so many things wrong, right? Because in the 10 years since then, I've changed my mind about things here and there. So the answer is yes, those things exist, and I don't like any of them, is the problem. I will say, my mentor is in the process of putting a gigantic 6-volume thing on this together. I don't know if or when it'll ever be done. When it happens, it'll probably be the best thing out there. I have a former student who is on the cusp of publishing just the priestly texts, but like on its own, so that can be read. This is an area where, on the one hand, work needs to be done, but on the other hand, I kind of firmly believe that this is going to be a technology issue, and what we're going to do is, eventually the place to do this is going to be online, where things can be like changed, and if I could publish all of my stuff online, and then when I change my mind, I could put a mark and say, this used to be this, here's why I changed, right? Like, and that I think is the future of the thing. We're just, like, I just haven't written the grant yet. Do you know what I mean? Like, that's, like, truly, that's where that is. So I'm sorry that it's not out there yet. Yes, in the back.
Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Okay. This question probably relates to what was just asked about how you choose what to put where, but it also, I think, relates to how you discern between hypotheses about, like, here's a problem based on the text, here's a proposed solution. So in science, which is where I come from, we have this principle called parsimony or parsimony, where, like, say you have an evolutionary tree, and there's multiple ways that you can explain how we have all these species. And if you have equally maybe valid hypotheses, you pick the simplest one, and you say which one had the least genetic changes. So I'm curious, is that a thing in biblical scholarship? And not what are other kind of like guiding norms for making decisions?
Yeah, so for me that's definitely a thing, right? And we often refer to it under the guise of Occam's razor, right? Which is the same principle, right? Like we should not multiply entities unless absolutely necessary. And one of the things that I want to be clear about, and it may come up again over the course of the semester, but again, what I'm proposing here with 4 sources is actually like a pretty stripped down version of what almost certainly happened, right? Like, there must have been, I mean, we know that there are multiple hands involved in the production of a text, from authors to editors and scribes and copyists and translators, and we can see in lots of cases how all of those hands get involved. But I think that, right, like to say, basically we're looking at here is 4 sources that were put together. Like that explains such an enormous percentage of the material that, to me, again, it is like the best, simplest, most coherent explanation. There are others, right? There are others who shall not be named, but like the people who don't agree with this theory, who produce what, to my mind, are incredibly complex, right? They will account for every single word, right? It was this story, and somebody added this, and someone later added this, and like, we all in my field have stories about like running into certain scholars who, they'll open to a page and it's got like 17 different codes on it for different authors and hands. And like, this is too much, right? In part because even though I may be oversimplifying, like the chances of me being like wrong, but just in a like it's a little too simplistic way, I will take those rather than coming up with a theory that explains every last bloody word and is almost certain, like 100% wrong, right? Like, there's no way you've identified absolutely everything in here. Like, I'm happier with a broader, more general, this is the principle of the thing. And yeah, I mean, I'll do work on the individual, down to the nitty gritty. But for me, yes, parsimony or Occam's razor is hugely important in terms of how close to right do I think I am? I think I'm pretty close to right, even if there is some rough stuff around the edges, right? Even if it's a little fuzzy, like the picture is clear. I can think of other metaphors, but I don't know how good they'd be. Other? Yes, please.
Can you talk a little more about this blessing through Abraham that you referenced earlier? Are there like times that's recalled later in history? Or?
Yeah. So the blessing of Abraham, right, in Genesis 12, this like super famous verses, is referred to, right, in all of the sources, again, like Abraham is blessed, right, in chapter 12 and 13 in J, in chapter 15 in E, in chapter 17 in P, and all of them then go on to refer back to it when they do the next generations, right? Like, I bless you with the blessing I gave Abraham, or references to the blessing of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or and this comes back later in the story, right? Why does God rescue the Israelites from Egypt? Because God remembers the promise he made to the patriarchs. The notion, maybe I think you're asking about the specific notion of, at the end, of like, they will bless themselves by that sort of thing. That language comes up not just in Genesis, but a couple of other times in the Bible. I think Jeremiah has a reference to this notion of families blessing themselves by you. My favorite example, and it's one that I think most people don't pick up on, is we haven't gotten there yet. We've gotten anywhere yet, but in the book of Numbers we have the Balaam. You probably pronounce it Balaam. Right, like I'm gonna get you not to pronounce things like Americans. The Bible, Balaam. It's that story though, where he's asked to curse. He's told to curse, and instead he blesses. I think is directly picking up on this thing with Abraham, where essentially, what the Balaam goes out and does is looks over the Israelites and essentially says, boy, you guys are really doing great. Like, we should all be as good as you, right? Like, and I think that's a place within the Pentateuch itself where the notion of other non-Israelites blessing themselves in the name of Abraham. I should also say, I mean, well outside the Bible, within Judaism, this is like exactly how blessings happen, right? Parents bless their children, right? May you be blessed like, Isaac and Jacob, or Isaac and Ishmael and Jacob and Esau. May you be blessed like like Rachel and Leah. So that mechanism of blessing is a very Jewish one, and I think is also there biblically as well. Okay, question time was fun. I'm going to try and I will do my best to leave room for questions as we move along. Otherwise, thanks. I will see you in a couple of days.